Welcome to this video on beginning Rails 8, where we'll talk about user authentication. Now, user authentication or authentication is verifying who the user is. Now, we usually do this with a password. If someone comes to your website and they create a new account, they provide a password, and to verify that they're the same user when they come back, you ask them for their password again. Now, authorization, on the other hand, is once you know who the user is, does this user have permission to perform this action? Like, can this user delete this task in my database, or can they edit this task? When you're asking those questions, that's authorization. When you're asking who is this user, that's authentication. And we'll mostly be talking about authentication in this video, but we will do a little bit of authorization in this video, and we're going to write our own authorization, but there are some gems that can help you if you have a really complex application that requires lots of different rules and roles for authorization. One of those gems is called can. Now, to implement user authentication, we could go with a local strategy, and usually a local means we're going to use a password. Versus a federated authentication system means we're going to kind of outsource our authentication to some other party. Now, this is the login with GitHub, or which we'll do in another video, but also login with Google or Facebook or something like that. And that's a federated login. Then to be able to authenticate a user, of course, we use passwords. That's what we're going to do in this video. But there are options like using passkeys, which are brand new. And if you can use passkeys, that's a really good option. Biometrics, usually biometrics are on some device, either a Face ID or a fingerprint, and that unlocks the passkey that you can use to log into a website. So passkeys are this new thing, and I highly recommend using passkeys on your own. When you go to log into sites, if there is a passkey option, use it because it's a lot more secure than a password. Now, as we implement our user authentication system, we're going to use Rails built-in generator that's going to generate us some code that's going to help us do authentication. It's actually going to do a lot for us, but there are other options. There's Devise or some other gems. Now, the reason why you might want to use Devise or other gems is you might want to, say, use passkeys instead of passwords, or you might want text messages as a multi-factor authentication system. And those are probably a lot easier if you use Devise or some other gem to implement your user authentication. But for this app, it's just a to-do list. We're going to go with basic authentication with passwords, and we're going to use Rails Generator to do it. Now, in this video, I'm not going to discuss much of the code that's going to get created by these generators and go through them much. I'm just going to show you what you need to do to implement your authentication logic. And then if you're taking my class, I'll explain a lot more about the code that these generators generate. But for this video, it's going to focus most on just implementing your own user authentication. But I highly recommend, if you're watching this video, to do some research and figure out the code that's been generated by these generators so that you can understand what's going on. Authentication is a really important part of your web application, and it's where a lot of your site security comes in. And if you don't understand the code, you could end up making a lot of security holes and not protecting your users or your data. So we'll get started by running Rails Authentication Generator. So bin Rails G for generate authentication. And now if you see here, we see that this actually failed because bcrypt is not installed in our gems, and it needs bcrypt to be installed. So if you notice, the generator already generated us quite a bit of code, and it even modified our gem file, and it uncommented this line bcrypt. But we just got to get this installed. So when we install new gems, you always have to close your server or exit it by holding Control C. Then we can run bundle to install the new gems, and you can see that it's installing bcrypt, and then we can go ahead and start our server again. With this, the generator did not finish, so we want to run it again. It's okay, it'll just generate the same code for everything it's already done, but hopefully this time it'll be able to generate everything that we need to, so just run that command again. And now you can see that it actually created some migrations that Visual Studio Code wants us to run. But let's just quickly look at those migrations. So you can see it creates a user table with an email and a password digest. And if you wanted more fields, now would be a good time to add those fields in, but I'm going to add more fields later on. It also creates us a session model. And this is what a session means. When somebody comes and visits your site, they create in a session, and then you can store data in that session that'll track that user as they visit different pages in your site. So this is a great way to store who is logged in on your site, so you can print it out on every page. So we're going to store that session in the database. So to get those tables into our thing, we do need to run those migrations. Of course, you might have been able to click on the Run Migration button. Running bin Rails DB migrate, we'll go ahead and create those two tables in our database. Just quickly to note, we do have a user model in our database, and notice it has secure password. That's what needs bcrypt. But we also relate users to the session so that we can log users into a session. The current model as well is not stored in the database, but hopefully you can look up more about this model. But this is how we're going to get our current user out, or whoever's logged into our site at the time. But now that we have all that set up, we can go into the console and create our first user. So we'll go u equals user.new. So now we have a new user, and you can see we have an email address and a password digest. Now notice there's no password field here. There's no password confirmation field because we're not saving our password in plain text in the database. Let's see how this works. We'll go ahead and add an email onto this user. And now that we have this email, we'll try to save this user in the database. And when we click save, you notice it says false. And we can go u.errors, and we'll see that the password is blank. So in order to save this user, we have to set a password. Now we're not going to set the password digest. That's bcrypt's job. We just need to set this password field that will not be saved in the database. We're also going to set a password confirmation. This is to make sure that they type their password correctly. And if you notice, I got that wrong. So when I try to save this user, again, we get false. And this time there's an error on the password confirmation. It's a confirmation error, meaning the passwords don't match. Now, if we fix that and we correct their password, and now we can go ahead and save the user in the database, and that worked just fine. So now we have a user in the database. Now, if we print this user out, if you notice some filtering is going on. Rails does not want to leak email addresses or passwords into the logs or onto the console, so they usually filter those out. There is a way that we can see it by saying u.passworddigest. And if we spell that right, we see our password digest, what looks like a bunch of random strings, but this stores the salt and the hashed out password, and there's no way to take this string and figure out what the password is. Now, because I haven't deleted this user out of memory, this user is still in this console and I haven't gotten rid of them, the password is still stored in memory. It's still secret. But if I exit the console, enter back in the console, and get that user back out of the database, now the password is nil. So we don't know what the original password is. We do have the password digest saved in the database, but there's no way to get this original user out. And just so you know, all that functionality happens because we have this has secure password in our user model. Now, this has secure password also gives us another method to look up users by their email address and their password. And that method is authenticate by, and we have to pass in a hash of their email address and their password. And so we have Fred's email address and Fred's password. And if we get the password correct, it'll load the user out of the database. Now, if we get the password wrong, it'll return nil. Also, if we get the email address wrong as well, meaning we don't have a user with that email address, we'll also get nil returned by this. So this means they have to have their email address and their password correct. Now the generator also generated us a sessions controller, a passwords controller, and also an authentication concern. So the authentication concern gets loaded through this application controller, and we include the authentication concern right here. So what is a concern? A concern is a bunch of code that we want to group together. We want to name it together. So all of our authentication logic belongs in one file. And so we call that authentication, but we want to share it with all of our controllers. So the easiest way to do that is to include it in the application controller. And if you notice, the rest of the controllers inherit from the application controller. So that includes all of our authentication logic. Now, we could put all of our authentication logic in this class, but now it's called the application controller, not the authentication. So we'd have to know that we included our authentication code in here, whereas this makes it very specific that this is our authentication logic. So that's what a concern is. So you might want to look through this file. I will point out one thing that it does is it adds a before action and it says require authentication. What that means is every page in our website is going to require that somebody is logged in. And if they're not logged in, it's going to redirect them to a login form. Now, our login form will be generated by our sessions controller. So creating a new session is like logging someone in, and then destroying a session is logging someone out. And this is our login form here. Now, if you notice, it says allow unauthenticated access to new and create, because when somebody visits our website and they want to log in, they're obviously not logged in. And that would mean that they couldn't visit the login form if they're not logged in unless we skip the authentication check. And that's what this does, is allows us to skip authentication checks. Now, we don't want people to have to log in to visit our root path, which is in our sites controller, or the about page. So let's add that skip so they don't have to be logged in to these to see these two pages. So I pasted that code into my sites controller, and now I'm going to replace new with index and create with about. That way we don't have to log in to see the index and about page. Now just let me comment this out to show you what would happen if we didn't include it. So we're on our home page right now, and if I give a refresh, you notice it redirects us to a login form. And that's because I commented this line out. If I put this back in and I save, going back to our home path, we're able to visit our home link and our about link without logging in. But as soon as we click the tasks, that we didn't put that in our task controller. So now it's requiring us to have a user logged in to visit this page. Now we'll open up our routes file. And if you notice, we have this resource session, and we also have our passwords controller. This is for a forgot password, or a way to reset your password if you forgot it. But right now, our login path is /session/new, and that's fine, but I like a better login path. So I'm going to do another named route. So I'm going to say get login goes to our sessions new action. That way on the URL, they can go /login instead of /session/new, which I think is a nicer URL. And I'll clean up other routes here since we already have the new route being /login, and we don't do a edit or an update session. We can limit the routes to just the create, which will process our login and check their password, and our destroy action, which logs someone out. But we don't need the rest of the routes for this session. Now, since I did clean out the new sessions path out of that with my routes, this right here will fail. This is if they visit a page where they have to be logged in. They'll redirect them to the login path, but now the new session path doesn't exist, so I better change this to login path. And that is in our concerns controller concerns authentication file. And just to test that that worked, we're on the home page, and that's fine because we don't have to be logged in, but we do have to be logged in to view our tasks. And if we look at our URL, it's /login. You can see my login form is not looking really good. We don't have labels for our text field. We just have placeholders here in the box, and they're different sizes. So let's go ahead and fix that. Now, again, the login path is this new action. And another thing that you notice here is if you visit this over 10 times within 3 minutes, you'll have to wait a little bit to log in. And that'll prevent people continually trying to guess someone's password. We will find a login form under this new view. So we can go to our views and we got our sessions, and it did create us a login form. Now, if you notice, it's printing out flash messages up at the top, but we've already taken care of those with our application layout that's printing out those, but we can set a title. And to make our form look a little bit nicer, all we need to do is use that bootstrap. form gem that we installed earlier, and this will make our form look like a bootstrap form. And if we want a blue button, there's is form.primary. Now refreshing, we have a much better login page. There is this forgot password, which should work, but I'll let you guys play around with that. And we'll go ahead and try to log in Fred that we created on the console. And once we're logged in, we can view our tasks page. Now this is another thing that happened is I clicked on this task link to get to my login path. It noticed I wasn't logged in, so it redirected me to log in. And after I logged in, it directed me back to the page I was trying to go to. So that's a really nice user experience. And we can go ahead and create new tasks and so on. Uh, Now we're still missing some sort of indication that we're logged in. We just have this search bar over here. It would be nice if we had a logout link and if we're logged in, and if we're not logged in, a login link up here. Another thing, it's not nice to include links that people can't see. So let's take out this tasks link if no one's logged in. Now, if you notice, there is a helper method called authenticated with a question mark that will return true if someone's logged in and false if they're not. And we can use this method in our views to figure out if someone's logged in or not. Now I'm editing my application layout file where I have my navigation bar, and we can just go ahead and add an if statement. If they're authenticated, then we'll show this link. If not, we'll skip it. And so just adding that if statement in, now if they're not logged in, they shouldn't see the tasks link. Of course, if we refreshed, we already have Fred that's logged in, so we do see this link here, but when he logs out, it should disappear. Now we have this form here that's our search form. I'm not going to use this, so I'm going to get rid of this form, and instead I'm going to add in login and logout links. So if they're logged in or authenticated, unfortunately we can't use this nav link anymore because we do have to use a button too, so we can send a delete request. But this will log them out. We go to the sessions path, or because it's a delete request, it will call the destroy method in the sessions controller and log us out. Now, if they aren't logged in, we'll have a link to the login path. Refreshing, we have this logout link that we can click on. And you could see here, I'm redirecting to the new sessions path, which doesn't exist because I renamed that to the login path. So we have this new sessions path here in our destroy method of our sessions controller, and we can just replace that with a login path. Now we're here on the login, and if you notice there's a login link because we don't have anyone logged in, we can log in Fred. And now we have a logout link and the task link shows up. Now this isn't quite all the way over to the right, so let me fix that. And if we just include these classes, that should fix it. And now our login button is over on the right. Now if you notice our login and our logout don't include any flash messages, so we can go ahead and add those. So we'll just have a notice when they're logged in and logged out. So we'll try logging Fred in again. And now we have a message saying they're logged in, and we get the logout button. And we click logged out, we'll get a message saying logged out. And also if they try to log in with an invalid account, we still have this error, so we need to fix that. So back in our sessions controller, we're still redirecting them to the login path if they're not authenticated, or to the new sessions path, and we need to redirect them to the login path. And try that again. And we now see this error message, and this is using the flash message we set up in our application layout file. Now, if you notice what's missing is a way to sign up. The generator did not create a user controller to be able to create new users and edit and delete users because they feel like that's something that's very personal to each application. Also, the fields for a user, it did create us a user model, but the fields are very basic with just an email and a password digest. What if we want to add more fields? Like I said before we ran the migration, we could have added new fields into our user model, but we can always create migrations and add fields afterwards. So I'm going to add a name to the user model. And we'll use the generator for that, bin Rails. So this time we're going to generate a migration. So it's not going to create us a model file. It's not going to create us a controller. It's just going to create us a migration. We can name this add name to users. And Rails is smart enough to pick up that it's going to have to add something to the users table. And so we can add a name and call it a string. Now, if you put an exclamation on the end, that makes the field required. And I do want it required. I do want every user to have a name. But right now we have Fred that's sitting in our database who doesn't have a name. So we'll see what happens when we try to run this migration and when we're requiring a name and Fred doesn't have one. So that created us our migration. And if you look, we're adding a name to users. It picked out that we want to add a column to the users table called name and make sure that it's never null or blank. And when we try to migrate that, it's going to fail. So the migration did not succeed because it failed the constraint, the not null constraint. So just like I said, Fred doesn't have a name. So what do we do with this? We could drop the users table and recreate it, but then all of our users would disappear. But that's something that maybe if you want to do that, you can. But remember, if we're working in teams and we're deploying this to production, it's probably not safe to start dropping tables and re-adding them, or else you're going to be deleting users that have already signed up for your website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going up here and I'm changing this to true temporarily. So that way our migration can succeed. So now I was able to migrate the database and add the name to the users table. Now in the console, I could go ahead and fix my models that don't have a name. So I'll pull the user out. I've only created one user so far, and then we'll go u.name equals Fred, and go ahead and save Fred. So now Fred has a name, and we'd have to do this for all the users that we created. There is a way that you can loop through all the users that don't have a name and just assign them a default name. And now we can't roll this migration back, or else we'll delete that column and we'll delete Fred's name out of the database. So what are we going to do? Well, let's create a new migration. So create a migration called make name required in users. Now, Rails isn't smart enough to have a command to make this field required. So we'll just have to run this migration. And opening it up, you see that there's nothing in there. We can call change column null, and we're talking about the users table, and the column is name, and we're going to make sure that null cannot be, or that it cannot be null. So now we'll save this migration file, and we can run it on the command line. And so now we have a required name field. We had to create two migrations for this to happen, but that's okay. That's exactly what migrations are for. And if we already have an application that's been launched live, we don't want to be dropping tables or deleting columns because that'll erase our data. So we do have to do stuff like this to make sure that our data stays consistent. So we can create users in the console, but now let's create a controller so that we can create users that way. So we'll use the generator to create a new controller called the users controller, and the new action will be our new form to create new users. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to allow people to create users or create accounts without being logged in. And now you can decide if you only want logged in users being able to create other users. That might be the case if you have a very limited application, but usually if they don't have an account, we want them to be able to visit this page. So we do need to allow them to visit the page without being authenticated. So we'll allow unauthenticated access to the new and create actions so that new users can sign up, can visit the form and sign up. Now for all this to work, we do need to fix our routes file, and we want to probably add another resource for users. Now I'm excluding the new action in this because just like our login link, I don't want the sign up page to be /users/new. Instead, I just want them to go to sign up to be able to create a new account. So we'll add a new named route called sign up. It will go to the new users action. Back in our application layout file, we'll add a sign up link right next to our login link that will go to our sign up path. Now I went ahead and did a lot of work off camera because this is just like our create action on our task controller or our notes controller. So this is the third time you're seeing this, but the new action will create a new user, and then we'll have a create action that will set the assignments from the parameters, create that new user. If we're able to save the user into the database, we'll redirect them to the root path and put a notice saying you're signed up. If we weren't able to save them, we'll render out the new view again with unprocessable content where they can fix their errors. Now, if you notice, I also added a validates the name, the presence of the name into my user model. That way I can make sure that all users have a name. And then in the new view, I added a title and a bootstrap form to be able to create a new user. So seeing if that all works, we'll go ahead and do a sign up. We'll add a name. This time we'll add George. And I messed up the password confirmation, so it doesn't match. But getting it right, we're able to sign up George. Now, if you notice, when I signed him up, it didn't log him in. We're just on the root page, and now we'd have to go log in. So let's fix that. So we can see in our sessions controller, when someone logs in, we need to start a new session for that user. So we can copy this line of code and paste it in here. We can start a new session, but this time it's the @user because we want to save this user in case we need to render them out in the view. So we're using @user instead of just user. So now we're creating an account for Mark. And not only are we signed up, but we're also logged in. Another thing we can do back in our application layout file is we can create a link to the current user's profile. Now the current user is the user that's logged in. So we got that current model, and hopefully you learned about that in class or some other way. We're getting the user that's logged in, printing out their name, and then we have a link to the user path. Now, if we click on that link right now, there's no show action, but I'll let you guys implement the show, edit, and update and destroy methods on the user controller yourself. They're going to be a lot like the task controller, and we'll move on to the next step. Now, the last step is our tasks. Right now, everybody sees and has the same tasks. So that might be one application you want where it's a joint task manager for everybody and they share tasks. But what I want is each user to have their own tasks. It doesn't matter who's logged in. Right now, they're all seeing their own tasks. Now, you might have an application where you want everybody to see your main model. But what you probably want is some sort of author so you know which user created this task or this post or this message or something. So we need a way to associate the users with this model tasks. So the first step is to modify our database so that we have a foreign key in our tasks model. And we're going to do a one-to-many relationship where a user has many tasks and the task belongs to a user. So the task model needs to be modified to have a user ID. So we'll create a new migration that adds a user to the task. So looking at the migration, sure enough, this adds our user to the task with a foreign key. But now our problem is we already have a lot of tasks in the database that do not belong to a user right now. So if we run this migration, we're going to get an error because it's required to have the user ID and what's the user ID of these tasks. But we can go ahead and add a default of 1. Now this means you have to have user 1 in the database or a user with the ID of 1. But as long as we do, it'll associate all the current tasks with the first user. So this is a good way to get around that problem. So migrating our database, we'll go ahead and add the user ID field onto our task model. So now that this migration worked, let's go ahead and create a migration to remove that default that I set. So we'll just create a new migration, remove default from task. And here on the tasks table, we'll take the user IDs default from 1 to nil. And let's go ahead and run that migration. And now the default's gone. So that's another little trick that we can get by to be able to migrate our table with these constraints in place. I went ahead and did a lot of work off camera, and I'll show you what I did. First of all, in my task model file, I noted that it belongs to a user, so we can create that one-to-many relationship. And then in my user model file, I have a has many tasks, and this dependent destroy means if I delete this user, I'll also delete all of their tasks, which is a good thing to do. The next thing I did is on the task controller under the index action, instead of loading all tasks, we'll just take our current user and pull out his tasks. Now we know this will work because This does not have an authentication skip action up here, so it requires that there's a user that's logged in, and we'll grab that user's tasks and we'll just display them. The other thing that we need to do is when we create a task, we'll say at task.user equals the user that's logged in. So whoever's logged in is the one that's going to own this task. Then for security reasons, we want to make sure that we only load tasks that belong to the current user out of the database. That way, if users try to go to the URL and change the ID numbers, they'll get a 404 error if they try to load a task that they do not own, which is exactly what we want to have happen. Now, we also want to modify the notes controller. First of all, we want to make sure that we're only going to load tasks that belong to the current users. So instead of just finding the task by its ID, we're going to make sure that it belongs to the current user. Other than that, everything else should still work, made tasks belong to users. Now I went ahead and logged in Fred, who was my first user, and you can see that the tasks that I created before are associated to him. That's because I set the default to Fred. And we can go ahead and log Fred out, and we'll log George in. And if we look, George has no tasks, so we can try to create a task. And now George has one task that belongs to him. We can view the task. We can view the task notes. There's no note. And now we have a note for that task. And so now when each user logs in, they'll have their own tasks instead of share tasks with other users. Now there is one more set of functionality that you can test out, and that is this forgot password link. And if we didn't change our login route, this would work without any problems. The only problem is our forms are not Bootstrap forms, so they don't look complete, but we can fix that. Now, first of all, in this passwords controller, you need to find everywhere it says new session path and replace that with login path. We have right here, we have a redirect to this used to say new session path, but I changed it to login path. Also, this update needs to be changed to login path, and this create right here needs to be changed to login path, or else we'll get errors saying it doesn't know what the new session path is. So another thing we need to do is kind of fix up our views. It will work without us doing this, but it is nice to fix these up. So in my new password, in my views, in my passwords folder, the new view, I added a title. I got rid of the flash message because that's already in our application layout file. And I added bootstrap form with so that this form will look nicer. And with the edit, I did the same thing. I added a title, took out the flash message, and added bootstrap form with so that we can have a nice form for our edit. We could also change these to say primary if we want our buttons to be blue. And so now if we go to the login page, we can click forgot password. If we add in a random email address that's not registered, it will still say that we've tried to send some instructions to reset it, but it won't really try to send anything. And then when we go ahead and put a email, or we'll go back to our forgot password and put in an email that is registered with our site, it'll say password reset instructions sent. Now, when you're in development, you're not going to actually send out emails. You probably don't even own the email addresses that you're using to test, so that's a good thing that we're not really sending out emails. When we deploy to production, we can set up the emails so that they can get sent. But for now, you can look in your log file when you're running your server, and you'll be able to see the HTML that's getting sent. Now, by the way, the HTML that's getting sent is in this passwords mailer, and also we have a layout for mailers here, so you can see this is what's getting sent in your email address. This is the plain text version right here. And we can see it get rendered here on our log file. And if you're using Visual Studio Code, you can hold down Command and click, and it will open that link in a new tab. And we can go ahead and update our password. Now it says password has been reset, so we can try to log in our user with that new password. And it worked. So that's all we'll do for our user authentication video. This did take a little bit of time, but imagine if we didn't have our authentication generators that generated a lot of code for us. So it was a lot easier than it normally would be. Authentication usually is a pretty hard thing to implement on your web applications, and that authentication generator does make it a lot easier.